Chapter 17. Casuaralia. "Casuaralia!" cried the slave girl, hurling a basket of sartana flour on me, and turning and running. I'd caught up with her in 5 steps, and kissed her roundly, swatted her, and sent her packing. "Casuaralia yourself," I said, laughing, and she, laughing, sped away. Around that time a large pan of warm water splashed down on me from the window some 16 feet above the street level. Wringing wet, I glared upward. I saw a girl in the window who blew me a kiss, and a slave girl. "Casuaralia!" she cried, and laughed. I raised my fist and shook it, and her head disappeared from the window. A builder, whose robes were stained with thrown fruit, hastily strode by. "You'd better be indoors," he said, "on Casuaralia." 3 male house slaves stumbled by, crowned with odorous garlands woven of the brack bush. They were passing around a boater of paga, and between dancing and trying to hold one another up, managed to weave unsteadily by. One of them looked at me, and from his eyes I judged that he may have seen at least 3 of me, and offered me a swig of the boater, which I took. "Casuaralia," he said, nearly falling over backwards, being rescued by one of his fellows, who seemed fortunately to be falling in the opposite direction at the same time. I gave him a silver coin for more paga. "Casuaralia," I said, and turned around, leaving, while they collapsed on one another. At that time a slave girl, a blonde girl, sped by, and the 3 slaves, stumbling, bleary-eyed, bumping into one another, dutifully took up her pursuit. She turned, laughing, in front of them, would run a bit, and then stop, and when they had nearly caught up with her, she would run on again. But to her astonishment, coming up from behind, catching her by surprise, another male seized her around the waist and held her, while she screamed in mock fear. But in a moment it was determined, to the rage of all save the girl, that she wore an iron belt. "Casuaralia!" she laughed, and wriggled free and sped away. I dodged a hurled llama fruit, which spluttered on the wall of the cylinder near me. The wall itself was covered with writing and pictures, none of it much complimentary to the masters of the area. I heard some breaking of pottery around the corner, some angry cries, and the laughing of girls. I decided I had better return to the house of Cernus. I turned down another street. Here, unexpectedly, I ran into a pack of some 15 or 20 girls, who, shrieking and laughing, surrounded me in a moment. I found myself wishing that masters bailed their girls for Casuaralia, so they might at least be heard approaching. Their silence in the street a moment before I had turned into it told me they had been hunting. They'd probably even had spies, advanced scouts, and now they crowded round me, laughing, seizing my arms. "Prisoner! Prisoner!" they shrieked. I felt a rope thrown round my throat, and it was drawn unpleasantly tight. It was held in the hand of a black-haired girl, collared, of course, long-legged, in brief slave livery. "Greetings," she said, "warrior," and she jerked menacingly on the rope. "You are now the slave of the girls of the Strait of Pots," she informed me. I felt 5 or 6 more ropes suddenly looped around me, drawn tight. 2 girls, even behind me, darted unseen to my ankles, and in an instant had looped and drawn tight ropes on them. My feet could thus be jerked from beneath me should I attempt to run or struggle. "What shall we do with this prisoner?" asked the black-haired girl of her fellows. Numerous suggestions were forthcoming. "Take off his clothes." "Brand him." "The whip." "Put him in a collar." "Now look here," I said. But they had now set off down the street, dragging me along amongst them. We stopped when I was pushed stumbling into a large room in which there were numerous baskets and harness hanging around, apparently a storeroom of sorts in an unimportant cylinder. A wide area had been cleared in the centre of the room, on which, over straw, had been spread some rep-cloth blankets. Against one wall there were two men, bound hand and foot. One was a warrior, and the other a handsome young town-keeper. "Caduralia," said the warrior to me, wryly. "Caduralia," I said to him. The black-haired girl, the tall girl, walked back and forth before me, her hands on her hips. She also strode over to the other two men, and then she returned to me. "Not a bad catch," she said. The other girls laughed and shrieked. Some leapt up and down and clapped their hands. "Now you will serve us, slaves," announced the black-haired girl. We were freed, save that the 2 ropes apiece were kept on our throats, and a rope on each ankle, each rope in the care of one of the girls. We were given some cups of tin, containing some diluted kalina that the girls had probably stolen. "After we have been served wine," announced the girl, "we will use these slaves for our pleasure." Before we were permitted to serve the wine, garlands of talanders were swiftly woven round our necks. Then each of us gave the girls wine, each asking, "Wine, mistress?" To which each of the girls, with a laugh, would cry out, "Oh yes, I will have wine." "You will serve me the wine, slave," said the long-legged black-haired girl. She was marvellous in the brief slave livery. "Oh yes, mistress," I said, as humbly as I could manage. I reached out to hand her the small tin cup. "On your knees," she said, "and serve me as a pleasure slave." The girls gasped in the room, and the 2 men cried out in anger. "I think not," I said. I felt the 2 ropes in my throat tighten. Suddenly the 2 girls on the ankle ropes jerked their ropes, and I fell heavily forward, spilling the wine to the stones. "Clumsy slave," jeered the long-legged girl, and the other girls laughed. "Give him more wine," ordered the long-legged girl. Another small tin cup was placed in my hands. I no longer much cared for their foolery. The long-legged girl, doubtless a miserable slave most of the year, seemed intent on humiliating me, taking revenge probably on her master, for whom I now stood as proxy. "Serve me wine," she ordered harshly. "Caduralia," I said humbly. She laughed, and so did the other girls as well. My eyes strayed to a room off the storeroom, in which I could see some boxes and much dust. Then the room was very still. I put down my head, kneeling, and extended the small tin cup to the girl. The other girls in the room seemed to be holding their breath. With a laugh, the long-legged girl reached for the tin cup, at which point I seized her wrists and sprang to my feet, swinging her off balance, and not releasing her, whirled her around, tangling her in the ropes, preventing them from being drawn tight. And then, while the girl shrieked and the long-legged girl cried out in rage, I swept her into my arms and leapt into the small room, where I dropped her to the stones and spun round, throwing the door shut and bolting it. I heard the angry cries of the girls and their fists on the door for a moment, but then I heard them suddenly begin shrieking and crying out loud, as though slavers might have fallen upon them. I glanced round the room. There was one window high in one wall, narrow and barred. There was no escape for the girl locked with me. I removed the ropes from my body and coiled them neatly and dropped them inside the door. I put my ear to the door, listening. After about 5 ain, I heard only a number of sobs, frustrated noises of girls in bonds. I opened the door and, not to my surprise, discovered that the warrior and the town-keeper were preventing the girls from escaping, having freed themselves, of course, in the moment of surprise and tumult in which I had seized the long-legged girl. They had bound the girls of the Street of Pots, probably one by one, while the other girls had looked on miserably, cuffed away if they tried to interfere. A long rope, or set of ropes knotted together, ran behind the kneeling girls, with which their wrists were bound, and another rope, or set of ropes tied together, fastened them by the throat, as in a slaver's chain. The long-legged girl was pushed into the larger room to observe her helpless cohorts. The black-haired girl sobbed. There were tears in the eyes of several of the girls. "Cassioralia," said the warrior cheerfully, getting to his feet after checking the knots that bound the wrists of the last girl and the ropes. "Cassioralia," I responded to him, waving my hand. I took the black-haired, long-legged girl by the arm and dragged her to the line of bound girls. "Behold the girls of the Street of Pots," I said. She said nothing, but tried to turn away. I permitted her to go to the centre of the room, where she stood facing me, tears in her eyes, near the rep-cloth blanket spread over straw. And then she looked down, defeated. "I will serve you wine," she said, "master." "No," I said. She looked at me puzzled. Oh, and then she nodded her head and reached to the disrobing loop on her left shoulder. "No," I said gently, and she looked at me startled. "I will serve you wine." She looked at me in disbelief, while I filled one of the small tin cups with the diluted Kalina and handed it to her. Her hand shook as she took the cup. She lifted it to her lips, but looked at me. "Drink," I said. She drank. I then took the cup from her and threw it to the side of the room, and took her into my arms, that lovely long-legged black-haired beast, provocative in the brevity of her slave livery, and kissed her, and well, and at length. Then she was lying on the rep-cloth blanket, spread over the straw beneath me, kissing me helplessly. "Do not let me escape," she begged. "You will not escape," I told her, reaching to the loop on her left shoulder. I heard one of the girls bound in the line whisper to the warrior and another to the townkeeper, "Do not let me escape, master." They removed these girls from the line, later returning them to it. The warrior, the townkeeper, and I remained the greater part of the day with the girls of the Street of Pots. When I had finished with the long-legged girl, I had bound her hand and foot and put her to one side. When we were preparing to leave, she begged again to be used, and was. This time, when I had finished with her, I didn't bind her, but stood her in front of me, my hands on her arms over the elbows. I would not trust her that she might free her fellows. The warrior, followed by the townkeeper, was moving down the line of bound girls, lifting their heads, taking their final wages for the sport, saying "Caduralia" to each, and moving to the next. Once more I kissed the black-haired, long-legged girl, and she me. "Caduralia," I said to her gently, and turned, and with the warrior and the townkeeper, arm in arm with garlands of talanders, which had been several times replaced, woven around our necks, left the Street of Pots. "Caduralia!" called the girls to us. "Caduralia!" we responded. "Caduralia!" I heard the long-legged girl call after me. "Caduralia, warrior!" "Caduralia!" I responded, well satisfied with the day's sport. The Caduralia, or the Holiday of Slaves, or Festival of Slaves, occurs in most of the northern civilized cities of known Gaul once a year. The only exception to this that I know of is Port Car in the delta of the Vosk. The date of the Caduralia, however, differs. Many cities celebrate it on the last day of the 12th passage hand, the day before the beginning of the waiting hand. In Ar, however, and certain other cities, it is celebrated on the last day of the 5th month, which is the day preceding the love feast. It had been a strange and eventful summer, fantastic in many ways. Week by week Ar became ever more wild, ever more lawless. Gangs of men, often armed, roamed streets and bridges, apparently undisturbed by warriors, their depredations not curbed, and startling when captured and sent to the central cylinder or the cylinder of justice. Pretext would be found for their release, customarily on legal technicalities, or on alleged lack of evidence against them. But as this lawlessness grew, and it became such that men would not walk the bridges without arms, the frenzy over the races and the games grew more rabid. It became rare on the streets and bridges to pass a person who would not, either for himself or for someone he knew, wear a faction patch, even on those rare days in which the stadium of Tarn stood empty. People seemed to care little for anything save the races and the games. Their neighbour's compartment might be despoiled by ruffians, but if they themselves were unharmed, they would think little of it, and hasten to their chosen entertainment, fearing only that they might be late. The duel for the lead in racing hung suspended among three factions: the Greens, the Yellows, and the Steels, the new faction. The progress and startling rise of the Steels as a faction dated from that first day of the races, when, in the 11th race, Gladius of Kos, astride a great tarn, initiated the Steels as a faction with a surprising but resounding win over a strong field of competitors. The great bird he rode was no racing tarn, but its size, its swiftness, its sureness, its incredible power and ferocity made it a terrible foe in the wars of the suspended rings. Indeed, never had it lost. Many of the other tarns of the Steels as well were not bred racing tarns, but war tarns, ridden by unknown riders, mysterious men hailing supposedly from far cities. The excitement of this new faction, not only competing but dangerously challenging the established factions of Ar, provided a spectacle that inflamed the imaginations of the men and women of Ar. Thousands of fans, for one reason and another, discouraged with their factions, or seeking novelty, or wishing to feel a part of the great battle of the races, sewed or pinned on their garments the small rectangle of bluish-grey cloth, faction patch of the Steels. I, masked in a leather hood, wearing bluish-grey silk, had again and again ridden the great black tarn for the Steels. The name of Gladius of Kos was a watchword in the city, though surely few knew his identity. I rode with the Steels because my tarn was there, and Mip, whom I had come to know and like, wished it to be so. I knew myself involved in games of a dangerous sort, but I had agreed to play, not clearly understanding the object or the goal of what I did. Relius and Ho Saul often assisted me. I gathered that it had not been a coincidence that had brought them to the house of Cernus. After each race, Mip, in detail, would discuss my riding, making suggestions. Before each race, he would explain to me what he knew of the habits of the riders in the towns I faced, which was almost invariably a great deal. He taught me to recognize for myself certain faults in their riders, certain exploitable characteristics in the flight patterns of the birds they rode. One rider, for example, had a tendency to take the third corner ring at the three-strap point, thus permitting a probable block at that point without slackening speed near the ring to that effect. One bird, a swift reddish tarn, which raced for the Blues, flown at least twice every 10 days, would, in approaching its perch, break with its wings an instant before necessary, thus making it possible, if following it closely, to strike the very perch it intended to take, rather than the next perch below it, as one would normally do. Equalling and perhaps exceeding the fame of Gladius of Kos was that of the swordsman Myrmilius of the cruel games observed in the Stadium of Blades. Since the beginning of Ankara he had fought more than 120 times, and 120 foes had fallen before him, which, following his unusual custom, he had never slain, regardless of the will of the crowd. Some of the best swordsmen of Ar, even warriors of high caste, eager to be the one to best the mysterious Myrmilius, had dared to enter the arena against him. But each of these bold gentlemen he seemed to treat with more scorn than his common foes, playing with them, and then, it seemed, when he wished, disabling their sword arm, so cruelly that perhaps they might never again lift steel. Condemned criminals and men of low caste, fighting for gold or freedom in the arena, he treated with the harsh courtesies obtaining among sword brothers. The crowd, each time he fought, went mad with pleasure, thrilling to each ringing stroke of steel, and I suspected that the man most adored in Ar was the huge, mysterious Mamilius, superb and gallant, a man whose very city was unknown. Meanwhile, the intrigues of Cernus, of the house of Cernus, threaded their way through the days and events of the summer. Once, in a Parga tavern, I saw a man whom I recognized to be one of the guards from the Iron Pens, though now in the tunic of a leather worker, and I heard him declaring that the city needed for its administrator not a builder, but a warrior, that law would again prevail. "But what warrior?" inquired a fellow at the table, a silversmith. "Cernus of the house of Cernus," said the disguised guard. "He's a warrior." "He's a slaver," said one. "He knows the business and needs of Ar," said the guard, "as would a merchant, but he is yet of the caste of warriors." "He sponsored many games," said a Thalarian keeper. "He would be better than an Henrabian," said another fellow. "My admission to the races," said another man, a miller, "has been paid 12 times by the house of Cernus." He referred to the practice of handing out passes, dated Alstraka, bearing the print of the house of Cernus, outside the gate of the slayer's house, which were dispensed on a first-come, first-served basis, 1,000 a day, each day of the races. Some men spent the night at the walls of the house of Cernus, that they might obtain their ostracan at dawn. "I say," said the disguised guard, "I could do worse than have such a man as Cernus on the throne." To my amazement, several around the table, who were undoubtedly common citizens of Ar, began to nod their heads. "Yes," said the silversmith, "it would be good if a man such as Cernus were administrator of the city." "Or Ubar," said the guard. The smith shrugged. "Yes, or Ubar." "Ar is at war with itself," said one man who had not spoken before, a scribe. "In these times, perhaps what one needs is truly an Ubar." "I say," said the guard, "Cernus should be Ubar of Ar." The men around the table began to grunt affirmatively. "Bring Parga," called the disguised guard, summoning a belled slave girl to him, one carrying a large vessel of Parga, that drinks might be dispensed yet once again. I knew the money spent so lavishly by the guard had been counted out carefully from the office of Caprice, for such information I had from Elizabeth. I turned and left, when I heard the men at the table, led by the guard, lifting their cups to Cernus of the house of Cernus. "May Cernus of the house of Cernus," they said, "become Ubar of Ar." I saw one other man rise up when I did, and also leave the tavern. Outside I stopped and turned, looking at Ho Tu, the keeper of the house of Cernus. "I thought you didn't drink Parga," I said. "I do not," said Ho Tu. "How is it that you are in a Parga tavern?" I asked. "I saw Phalarius leave the house," he said, "in the garb of a leather worker. I was curious." "It seems he was on the business of Cernus," I said. "Yes," said Ho Tu. "Did you hear them speak of Master Cernus as a possible Ubar?" Ho Tu looked at me sharply. "Cairns should not be Ubar," he said. I shrugged. Ho Tu turned and strode away between the buildings. While the men of Cairns did their work in the Parga taverns, and on the streets and in the market squares, and on the ramps and in the tiers of the games and races, the gold of Cairns and the steel of Cairns was apparently plied elsewhere. His loans to the Hinrabians, a wealthy family in itself, but surely unable to carry the incessant burdens of supporting games and races, became fewer and then stopped. And then, with great reluctance, claiming need, Cairns petitioned for the repayment of certain minor but significant portions of the loans. As these might be repaid from the private treasuries of the Hinrabians, he required ever larger payments, greater and greater portions of the moneys owed to his house by the Hinrabians. Further, games and races which he had sponsored in the name of the Hinrabians now ceased, and those they had jointly sponsored ceased to bear the name of the administrator. The name of Cairns as patron and benefactor was now what appeared on the placards and the boards of the announcements. Then, interestingly, minor omens, recorded by the High Initiate and others, began to turn against the Hinrabian dynasty. 2 members of the High Council, who had spoken out against the influence of merchants in the politics of Ar, presumably a veiled reference to Cairns, were found slain, one cut down by killing knife, and another throttled and found dangling from the bridge near his home. The first sword of the military forces of Ar, Maximus Hegesius Quintilius, second in authority only to Minus Tentius Hinrabius himself, was relieved to his post. He had shortly before expressed reservation concerning the investiture of Cairns in the caste of warriors. He was replaced by a member of the Taurentians, Ceremides of Tyrus, nominated by Sophronicus of Tyrus, captain of the Taurentians. Shortly thereafter, Maximus Hegesius Quintilius was found dead, poisoned by the bite of a girl in his pleasure gardens, who, before she could be brought before the scribes of the law, was strangled by enraged Taurentians, to whom she had been turned over. It was well known that the Taurentians had greatly revered Maximus Hegesius Quintilius, and they had felt his loss perhaps as deeply as the common warriors of Ar. I had known Maximus Hegesius Quintilius only briefly several years ago, when he had been a captain in 10,110 from the founding of Ar, in the time of Parker and his horde. He had seemed to me a good soldier. I regretted his passing. He was given a full military funeral. His ashes had been scattered from Tarnbach over a field where, as a general some years before, he had led the forces of Ar to victory. The demands of Cairns for repayment of moneys owed to him by the Hinrabians became increasingly persistent and unavoidable. Claiming need, he was implacable. The citizens of Ar generally found it distasteful that the private fortunes of the Hinrabians should be in such a poor state. Then, as I would have expected, within the month there were rumours of peculation, and an accounting and investigation, theoretically to clear the name of the Hinrabian, was demanded by one of the High Council, a physician whom I had seen upon occasion in the house. The scribes of the central cylinder examined the records, and, to their horror, discrepancies were revealed, in particular payments to members of the Hinrabian family for services it was not clear had ever been performed. Most outstandingly, there had been a considerable disbursement for the construction of 4 bastions and towncots for the flying cavalry of Ar, her townsmen. The military men of Ar had waited patiently for these cylinders, and were now outraged to discover that the monies had actually been dispersed and had apparently disappeared. The parties, presumably of the builders, to which the disbursements had been made, were found to be fictitious. Further, at this time, the odds merchants of the Stadium of Tarns made it known that the administrator was heavily in debt, and they, not to be left out, demanded their dues. It seemed almost to be a foregone conclusion that Minus Tentius Hinrabius would surrender the brown robes of office. He did so late in spring, on the 16th day of the 3rd month, that month which in Ar is called Camerius, in Corybar Selna. The day before he surrendered his robes to the high initiate, reading the liver of a sacrificial bosque, the initiate had confirmed what was by then anticipated by all, that the omen stood strongly against the Hinrabian dynasty. The High Council, receiving the promise of Minus Tentius Hinrabius to depart from the city, did not inflict officially the penalty of exile. He, with his family and retainers, left the city on the 17th day of Camerius. By the end of that month, the other Hinrabians of Ar, in the face of widespread public anger, hastily liquidated their assets at considerable loss, and fled from the walls of Ar, joining Minus Tentius Hinrabius some parsangs beyond the city. And then, together, the Hinrabians, with an armed retinue, set forth in caravan for Tor, envious of which city had granted their petition for refuge. Unfortunately, the caravan, not more than 200 parsangs from the great gate of Ar, was attacked and plundered by a large armed force, but of unknown origin. Strangely, with perhaps one exception, each of the Hinrabians had had his throat cut, even the women. This was unusual, for the women of a captive caravan, regarded as portions of its booty, are almost always enslaved. The one Hinrabian whose body was not found among the dead, scattered on the plains and amid the burning remains of the wagons, was, interestingly, Claudia Tentia Hinrabia. On the 20th day of Camerius, the great signal bar, suspended around the walls of the city, rang out the enthronement of an Ubar of Ar. Cernus had been proclaimed Ubar of Ar. As the Torrentians lifted their swords in salute, and the members of the High Council had stood on the tiers of the council chamber and cried out and applauded. Processions took place on the bridges. There were tournaments of the game organized. Poets and historians vied in praising the day, each more ecstatically than the last. But perhaps more importantly, holiday was declared, and great games and races were sponsored without cessation for the next 10 days, extending even through the third passage hand. I saw more in this, of course, than the work of Cernus. I saw in his elevation a portion of the plan of others being unfolded. With one of their own on the throne of Ar, they would have a remarkable base in Ar for the advancement of their schemes, in particular the influencing of men, the recruitment of partisans in their cause. As Misk had pointed out, a human being armed with a significant weapon can be extremely dangerous even to a priest-king. There was one point, however, in this strange summer, which seemed to me to give clear and adequate reason to rejoice. Elizabeth, with Virginia and Phyllis, would be extricated from the house and carried to safety. Capris, who had become more affable and apparently somewhat bolder following the enthronement of Cernus, perhaps because Cernus was less often in the house, informed me that he had made contact with an agent of priest-kings. The girls, even though I had not yet received the documents and maps, would be rescued. His plan was a simple one, but ingenious. The plan was to arrange to have the girls purchased by an agent of Priest King's on the love feast, which began tomorrow, an agent who would have the resources to outbid any conceivable competition. They would then be as naturally and neatly removed from the house as Elizabeth had originally been introduced into it. It was true that Elizabeth was no longer needed in the house, nor had she been for a long time. Capris had located important materials and was copying them. I was needed, of course, to take the documents and Capris from the house. Elizabeth predictably did not care to leave without me, but she recognized the plan as a good one. If she could be independently removed from the house, there would be less for Capris and me to worry about. Further, she naturally wished Virginia and Phyllis to have the same opportunity for freedom as she had for herself, an opportunity they might be unlikely to obtain elsewhere. And further, of course, she recognized that it might well be complex and difficult for me to attempt to convey documents, Capris, herself and myself, and 2 others as well, from the house. All things considered, Capris' plan seemed not only suitable, but ideal. Neither Elizabeth nor I, of course, said anything to Virginia or Phyllis. The fewer people who knew of the plan, the better. Surely, if kept in ignorance, their behaviour would be more natural. Let them think they were to be sold from the block. It would be a fine surprise for them later to discover that they were actually being whisked to safety and freedom. I chuckled. I was further cheered by the thought that Capris had informed me his work was coming along very well, and he hoped to have the documents and maps copied by the beginning of Saqqara. I gathered now that Cairnes, spending much of his time in the central cylinder as Ubar, meant Capris' opportunities for work had been substantially increased. Saqqara was, of course, a long wait. Still, it was better than nothing. Other dates he had set similarly, I reminded myself, had not turned out. But still I was pleased. Elizabeth, with Virginia and Phyllis, would be rescued, and Capris seemed in good humour, and that was perhaps significant, betokening an end in sight for my mission. In thinking about this, I realized what a brave man Capris was, and how little I had respected his courage and his work. He had risked much, probably more than I, and I felt ashamed. He was only a scribe, and yet what he had done had taken great courage, probably more courage than that possessed by many warriors. I found myself whistling. Things were working out. I regretted only that I had not yet learned who it was that had slain the warrior from Thentis. Cairnes, upon occasion, though Ubar of Ar, would return to sit table at his own house, where, as he had invariably done before, he would play with Capris, losing himself in the movements of the red and yellow pieces on the large board of red and yellow squares. Cairnes, upon occasion, though Ubar of Ar, Sorry. He was only a scribe, and yet what he had done had taken great courage, probably more courage than that possessed by many warriors. I found myself whistling. Things were working out. I regretted only that I had not yet learned who it was who had slain that warrior from Thentis. Cairnes, upon occasion, though Ubar of Ar, would return to sit at the table in his own house, where, as he had invariably done before, he would play with Capris, losing himself in the movements of the red and yellow pieces on the large board of red and yellow squares. This was the evening of Caduralia. There was much hilarity in the hall of the house of Cernus, and though it was early in the evening, Parga and full-strength Calinar were flowing. Ho-Tu threw down his spoon in disgust, grinning at me wryly. His gruel had been salted to the point of being inedible. He glared disgustingly down at the wet mash of porridge and salt. "Caduralia, master," said Elizabeth Cardwell to Ho-Tu, smiling sweetly as she passed with a pitcher of Calinar. Ho-Tu seized her by the wrist. "What is wrong, master?" inquired Elizabeth innocently. "If I thought it were you," growled Ho-Tu, "who dared to salt my porridge, you would spend the night sitting in a slave goad." "I would never think of doing such a thing," protested Elizabeth, wide-eyed. Ho-Tu grunted, and then he grinned. "Caduralia, little wench," he said. Elizabeth smiled. "Caduralia, master," she said, and turned quickly around, still smiling, and went on with her work. "A little pock-face," called Relius. "I would be served." Virginia Kent, with her picture of Calinar, ran light-footedly to Relius, guard in the house of Cernus. "Let Lana serve Relius wine," said another girl, a red silk girl, first to the guard, leaning toward him, lips parted. Relius put out his cup, but before the girl could pour the wine, she seemed suddenly to fly off the back of the dais, the seat of her tunic firmly grasped in the small hand of Virginia Kent. Lana landed with a considerable bump on the stones of the hall, the wine flowing backward. "Relius guards Virginia," the young slave from Earth informed the collared red silk Lana. Lana scrambled to her feet, angry, her pitcher of wine set aside on the wet red stones. The two girls stood facing one another. "I wear the leash of Relius," said Virginia. "I wear his bracelets." Lana looked at Relius. "Leash Lana," she said. "Lana is red silk." And she extended her wrists provocatively to Relius. "Put your bracelets on Lana. She is red silk. She will serve you better than a silly little white silk." "No!" cried Virginia. Lana turned and faced her contemptuously. "Why should you wear the leash of a man such as Relius?" she said. "He has chosen to guard me," said Virginia. Lana turned and looked at Relius. "Guard Lana," she said. At this point Virginia Kent put down her pitcher of wine, seized Lana by the shoulders, spun her around, and struck her a rather severe blow near the left eye. Several of the men and the girls at and around the tables approvingly observed the two girls rolling and scratching, biting and tearing on the floor, first white silk on top, and then red silk, and then white silk again. At last Virginia Kent, to the cheers of several of those present, sat atop Lana and was pummelling her mercilessly until Lana, throwing up her arms and shrieking, crying out, begged for mercy. "Who wears the leash of Relius?" demanded Virginia. "Virginia," screamed Lana. "And who his bracelets?" "Virginia." "And who does Relius guard?" "Virginia, Virginia," wept Lana, trying to cover her face. "Virginia." And then Virginia Kent, breathing hard, climbed to her feet. Lana scrambled up and stood some feet from her, tears in her eyes. "You will be sold tomorrow," cried Lana. "Then Relius will guard another." And the girl looked at Relius. "I hope it will be Lana who will wear the leash of Relius," she said. And then, as Virginia Kent cried out and leapt toward her, Lana turned round and sped as though for her life from the room. "It seems I am not going to be served," said Relius, as though rather bored with the whole matter. Virginia Kent straightened herself, bent down and picked her pitcher of Calinar up, smiled shyly, and approached her guard. He put forth his goblet, but suddenly, unexpectedly, she drew back the pitcher. "What is the meaning of this?" he cried. "Caduralia," she laughed. "You will not serve me?" said Relius in anger. Virginia Kent, to my amazement, put aside the pitcher of wine. "I would serve you," she said, and put her hands behind his neck and suddenly pressed her lips, to the delight of those present, boldly to his. "Casuarina," she whispered. "No, Casuarina," he mumbled, closing his arms upon her, devouring her. But when he permitted her to draw back her lips, there were tears in her eyes. "What is wrong, little pock-face?" asked Relius. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will be sold." "Perhaps you will find a kind master, little slave," said Relius. The girl put her head to his shoulder and wept. "I do not want Virginia to be sold," she wept, "unless it be Relius who will buy her." "Do you wish truly to be my slave, little pock-face?" asked Relius. "Yes," wept Virginia, "yes." "I cannot afford you," said Relius, holding her head against him. I turned away. Near the pit of sand, several slave girls, dancers in pleasure silk, were kneeling back on their heels and clapping their hands with glee. In the pit of sand, one of the guards, utterly drunk, was performing a ship dance, the movements of his legs marvellously suggesting the pitch and roll of a deck, his hands moving as though climbing rope, and then hauling rope, and then splicing and knotting it. I knew he had been of Port Car. He was a cutthroat, but there were drunken tears in his eyes as he hopped about, pantomiming the work of one of the swift galleys. It is said that men, once having seen Thassa, are never willing to leave it again, that those who have left the sea are never again truly happy. A moment later another guard leapt into the pit of sand, and to the amusement of the girls began a dance of Lal hunters, joined by 2 or 3 others in a file, dancing the stalking of the beast, the confrontation, the kill. The man who had been dancing left the pit, and over against one wall, in the shadows of the torchlight, largely unnoted, danced alone, danced for himself in the memories of gleaming Thassa and the swift black ships, the tarns of the sea, as the galleys of Port Car are known. "Serve me wine," Ho Searle ordered Phyllis Robertson, though she was far across the room, and there were several girls nearer. This was not unusual, however, for Ho Searle invariably demanded that the proud Phyllis, who professed to despise him, serve him as table slave, which service she would ultimately, irritably, head in the air, have to render to him, whether it be merely the pouring of his wine, or the offering of a grape held delicately between her teeth. I heard Capra say, as though marvelling, "I shall capture your whole stone in 3 moves." Cernus grinned, and clapped his hands on the scribe's shoulders. "Casuarina," he laughed. "Casuarina." "Casuarina," mumbled Capris, rather depressed, making the first essential move, but now without zest. "What is this?" cried Ho Searle. "It is Bosc milk," Phyllis informed him. "It's good for you." Ho Searle cried out in rage. "Casuarina," said Phyllis, and turned and moved away with a triumphant twitch that might have shocked even Sura. Ho Searle bounded over the table and caught her 4 paces from the dais, spilling the milk about. He threw her bodily over his shoulder, her small fists pounding on his back, and carried her to Ho Too's place. "I will pay," said Ho Searle, "the difference between what she will bring as red silk and white silk." Phyllis, shrieking in fear, wiggled on his shoulder, pounding. Ho Too apparently gave the matter very serious thought. "Do you want to be red silk?" he asked Phyllis, who from her position couldn't see him. "No, no, no!" she cried. "By tomorrow night," pointed out Ho Searle neatly, "she may be red silk anyway." "No, no!" wept Phyllis. "And where will you make her red silk?" asked Ho-Tu. "Oh, the pit of sand will do," said Ho-Searle. Phyllis shrieked with misery. "Would you not like Ho-Searle to make you red silk?" asked Ho-Tu of Phyllis. "I detest him," she screamed. "I hate him, I hate him, I hate him." "I wager," said Ho-Searle, "I can have her leaping to my touch in a quarter of an hour." That didn't seem to me much time. "An interesting wager," mused Ho-Tu. Phyllis shrieked for mercy. "Put her in the sand," said Ho-Tu. Ho-Searle carried the struggling Phyllis Robertson to the square of sand and flung her at his feet. He then stood over her, hands on hips. She could roll neither to the left or right. She lay on her back between his sandals, one knee slightly raised as though she would flee, and lifted herself on her elbows, terrified, looking up at him. He laughed and she screamed and tried to escape, but he took her by the hair and, crouching over her, pressed her back weeping to the sand. His hand moved to the disrobing loop, and she shuddered, turning her head away. But instead of tugging on the loop, he simply, holding her under the arms, lifted her up, and then dropped her on her seat in the sand, where she sat foolishly, bewildered, looking up at him. "Casualia!" laughed Ho-Searle, and turned, and to the laughter of all returned to his place at the table. Ho-Tu was laughing perhaps the loudest of all, pounding on the table with his fists. Even Cernus looked up from his game and smiled. Phyllis now struggled to her feet, blushing a red visible even under the torches, and unsteadily, trembling slightly, was trying to brush the sand from her hair, her legs, and her slave livery. "Don't look so disappointed," said a red silk girl passing nearer Calinar. Phyllis made an angry noise. "Poor little white silk slave," cried another red silk girl passing between the tables. Phyllis clenched her fist, crying out in rage. Ho-Searle regarded her. "You are rather fat," he said. Now that was an appraisal I surely did not agree with. "I'm glad I'm going to be sold," cried Phyllis. "It will take me from the sight of you, you black-haired scarred task." And there were tears in her eyes. "I hate you," she screamed. "I hate you." "You are all cruel," cried Virginia Kent, who was standing now a bit behind Ho-Tu. The room was extremely silent for a moment, and then angrily Virginia Kent picked up Ho-Tu's bowl of gruel, and turning it completely upside down, dumped it suddenly on his head. "Casualia," she said. Relius nearly leapt up, horror on his face. Ho-Tu sat there with the porridge bowl on his head, the gruel streaming down his face. Once again there was an extremely still moment in the room. Suddenly I felt a large quantity of fluid, wine, surely at least half a pitcher, being poured slowly over my head. I began to splutter and blink. "Casualia, master," said Elizabeth Cardwell, walking regally away. Now Ho-Tu was laughing so hard that his eyes were watering. He took the bowl from his bald head and wiped his face with his forearm, and then he began to pound the table with his fists. And then after a moment everyone in the room, amazed at the audacity of the slave girl to so affront one of the black caste, began to roar with amusement, even the slave girls. I think so rich a treat they had never expected at Casualia. I maintained a straight face and tried to frown convincingly. Finding myself the butt of their laughter, I saw that even Cernus had now looked up from his board and was roaring with laughter, the first time I had ever seen such amusement in the person of the master of the house of Cernus. And then, to my horror, I saw Elizabeth, her back straight, her step determined, walk straight to Cernus, and then slowly, as his mouth flew open, and he seemed scarcely to understand what was occurring, she poured the rest of the contents of the vessel of Calinar directly on his head. "Caduralia," said Elizabeth to him, turning away. Ho-To then, to my great relief, rose to his feet, lifting both hands. "Caduralia Ubar," he cried. And then all at the table, even the slaves who had served, stood and lifted their hands, laughing, saluting Cernus. "Caduralia Ubar," they cried. And I too, though the words nearly stuck in my throat, so acclaimed Cernus. "Caduralia Ubar," I cried.